You used to argue differently, faster, sharper, more invested. If someone misunderstood you, you corrected them immediately. If someone challenged your opinion, you defended it. If someone dismissed your perspective, you felt it. Not just intellectually. Personally, there was urgency. You needed clarity. You needed resolution. You needed to be understood. Now something has changed. You still have opinions. You still notice disagreement, but you don't feel the same charge. You pause more. You let comments pass. You disengage from debates that once would have pulled you in. And sometimes that shift confuses you. You wonder, am I becoming passive? Why don't I care as much? Why does it feel pointless now? At first glance, it might look like indifference. But look deeper. Do you truly not care? Or do you simply no longer experience disagreement as a threat? Carl Jung observed that much of human conflict is not about ideas. It's about identification. When the ego fuses with belief, disagreement feels like an attack on the self. If your opinion is your identity, then contradiction feels dangerous. Earlier, you may have been strongly identified with your views, not because you were arrogant, but because your ego relied on them for stability. Your beliefs anchored your sense of self. So when someone challenged your perspective, it felt destabilizing, and destabilization triggered defense. Defense often looks like argument, but argument is rarely about truth. It is about protection. Jung wrote extensively about complexes, emotionally charged clusters of associations that seize the ego when activated. When a complex is triggered, you don't just respond. You react. Your tone sharpens. Your body tightens. Your thoughts accelerate. You feel compelled to prove, because something inside feels threatened. Now, you may notice that same stimulus, disagreement, critique, contradiction, no longer triggers the same intensity. You still register it, but you are not seized by it. That reduction in seizure is integration. It means the ego is less fused with its opinions. You can hold a belief without becoming it. That separation changes everything. Earlier, arguments may have felt energizing. Winning felt stabilizing. Clarity felt necessary. Now, you might think, this isn't worth it. Not because you've lost conviction, but because your identity no longer depends on external agreement. Jung believed that individuation involves differentiating the ego from its projections and identifications. When you withdraw projection, you stop attributing exaggerated meaning to disagreement. You no longer assume, if they reject my idea, they reject me. That distinction alone reduces argument dramatically. You may also notice that you don't feel the same urgency to correct misinformation. Earlier, you may have felt responsible for setting the record straight. Now you assess, is this conversation constructive? Is this person open? Is this worth the energy? If not, you let it go. That restraint may look like passivity from the outside, but internally it feels stable. There is less heat, less adrenaline, less compulsion. Jung warned that ego inflation often expresses itself through moral superiority and rigid certainty. When we over-identify with being right, we become addicted to correction, addicted to proving, addicted to dominance in conversation. He even wrote that idealism itself can become an addiction when we cling to ideas in order to reinforce identity. As psychological maturity develops, this addiction weakens. You may still care deeply about your values, but you no longer need to assert them constantly. You may still disagree, but you don't need to convert. You may still notice flaws in logic, but you don't need to dismantle them publicly, because your sense of self no longer rests on being validated. That shift reduces argument naturally. You are not avoiding conflict. You are not suppressing your voice. You are evaluating cost. Earlier, argument may have been automatic. Now it is deliberate, and deliberation reduces frequency. You may also feel something surprising. Arguments feel exhausting, not stimulating, not invigorating, just draining, because your nervous system is less interested in combat. Earlier, conflict may have activated you. Now, it dysregulates you. And because you are more aware of your internal state, you avoid unnecessary dysregulation. That avoidance is not fear. It is regulation. Jung believed that as consciousness expands, Opposites can coexist without immediate tension. You can hold your belief while acknowledging another's. That capacity reduces polarity. Reduced polarity reduces argument. You no longer feel compelled to collapse difference into victory. You can tolerate disagreement without personalizing it. This is a major shift, because personalization is what fuels conflict. When opinions are detached from identity, they lose their emotional charge. You may notice that you listen more now. Earlier, you were preparing your rebuttal while the other person spoke. Now you actually hear them, not because you agree, but because you are not threatened. And when you are not threatened, you do not need to fight. This stage can feel unfamiliar. If you once defined yourself as passionate, assertive, intellectually sharp, argument was part of your identity. Now that argument is less central, you may feel softer, less intense, less defined. But softness is not weakness. It is flexibility. And flexibility is strength without rigidity. You are not becoming indifferent. You are becoming less identified. And when identification loosens, the need to win dissolves. Winning is important only when losing feels like losing yourself. Now, disagreement does not feel like erasure, so you no longer need victory to feel stable. You are not less intelligent, not less capable, not less strong. You are less reactive. And reactivity is not the same as conviction. Conviction can be quiet. Conviction does not need volume. Right now, your relationship with conflict is changing, not because you've given up, but because your ego no longer depends on combat for reinforcement. And that shift, though subtle, signals profound psychological consolidation. You don't argue less because you're weak. You argue less because you're less fused. And that changes the entire emotional structure of disagreement. The biggest shift isn't that you argue less. It's that disagreement no longer feels like disrespect. Earlier, if someone challenged your view, something tightened. Your body reacted. Your tone sharpened. Your mind raced to defend. You didn't just want to respond. You needed to respond. Because underneath the disagreement was a deeper fear. If they invalidate my perspective, they invalidate me. Carl Jung understood that when the ego fuses with ideas, those ideas become extensions of identity. A political view, a moral stance, a philosophy, a personal story. When these are unconscious identity anchors, contradiction activates threat, and threat activates defense. Defense becomes argument. But now, something has changed. You can hear an opposing view without feeling erased. You can let someone be wrong without feeling compelled to correct them. You can walk away from a debate without feeling defeated. That shift is not apathy. It is differentiation. Jung described individuation as the gradual separation of ego from its unconscious identifications. When this separation happens, you begin to realize, I have beliefs, but I am not my beliefs. That subtle distinction weakens emotional charge. Earlier, arguments may have felt like battles. Now they feel like exchanges. Earlier, being misunderstood felt intolerable. Now it feels inconvenient, but survivable. That survivability reduces urgency. You may also notice that you no longer assume bad intent as quickly. Earlier, disagreement triggered suspicion. Why are they attacking me? Why are they dismissing my experience? Now you can consider, they see it differently. That cognitive flexibility reduces escalation. Jung believed that much of human conflict comes from projection. We project our insecurities, fears, and unresolved complexes onto others. When someone challenges us, it activates unresolved material. If you once argued intensely, ask yourself, what was actually being defended? Was it the idea? Or was it your sense of competence? Your intelligence? Your moral worth? As you integrate shadow material, you become less fragile around these areas. You don't need constant external reinforcement to feel stable. And without fragility, argument loses its addictive quality. Because argument can be addictive. The adrenaline, the clarity, the feeling of intellectual dominance. Jung warned that idealism itself can function like a narcotic, a way to inflate the ego through righteousness. When you are less inflated, righteousness softens. You still care, but you don't moralize every disagreement. You no longer feel the need to convert others. That shift can feel disorienting, especially if you once prided yourself on being sharp, articulate, and formidable in debate. Now, you may hold back, not out of fear, but out of proportion. You assess, is this person open to dialogue? Is this environment constructive? Is this worth destabilizing my nervous system? If the answer is no, you disengage. That disengagement is not avoidance. Avoidance feels anxious. Regulation feels calm. There's a profound difference. Avoidance says, I can't handle this. Regulation says, I don't need to handle this. Jung emphasized the importance of holding opposites without collapsing into one-sidedness. When you can tolerate contradiction without erasing your own stance, argument becomes optional. Optional conflict is rarely pursued. Earlier, conflict may have been compulsive. Now it is selective. You may also notice that your identity feels less rigid. You are more open to being wrong, more open to nuance, more open to changing your mind. That flexibility reduces defensive energy. Defensiveness thrives on certainty. Flexibility thrives on confidence. And confidence does not need to shout. Another shift is this. You no longer derive energy from proving superiority. Earlier, winning an argument may have felt validating. Now it feels empty because your sense of worth is less externally constructed. You don't need to be the smartest voice in the room. You don't need to dismantle someone publicly. You don't need applause for your clarity. That reduction in performative engagement makes you appear quieter, but internally it feels stable. Jung believed that as we integrate more of ourselves, we become less polarized, less extreme, less reactive, less addicted to opposition. Opposition once sharpened identity. Now, identity is internally consolidated, and when identity is consolidated, conflict becomes less compelling. You may even feel compassion in moments that once triggered aggression. You see someone arguing intensely and recognize the insecurity underneath. You see someone defending rigidly and recognize identification. That recognition disarms you because you've seen it in yourself. Shadow integration reduces the urge to dominate. You know what it feels like to be possessed by certainty, so you don't need to punish it in others. This doesn't mean you tolerate disrespect. It doesn't mean you abandon boundaries. It means you choose your battles deliberately. And deliberate choice looks like restraint. Restraint looks like quiet. But quiet in this case is not weakness. It is ego stabilization. You are not less capable of arguing. You are less dependent on it. And that dependence was the real driver. Now, disagreement does not feel like existential threat. It feels like difference. And difference does not require combat. It requires discernment. That discernment is the mark of psychological maturity. You are not arguing less because you're disengaged from life. You are arguing less because you're less fused with identity defense. And when identity defense dissolves, conflict becomes optional, not urgent, not addictive, not necessary, just optional. And that shift changes the entire emotional structure of how you relate to disagreement. At some point, you realize something quietly powerful. You are still capable of arguing. You just don't feel compelled to. That distinction matters, because the absence of compulsion is not weakness. It is freedom. Earlier, arguments may have felt like arenas, places where identity was reinforced. You proved intelligence. You proved moral clarity. You proved strength. And proving felt stabilizing. Carl Jung understood that when the ego is still consolidating itself, it seeks reinforcement. It seeks validation through contrast. I am right because you are wrong. That polarity sharpens identity. But once identity stabilizes internally, contrast is no longer required. You don't need someone else to be wrong for you to feel coherent. That removes the emotional urgency from conflict. Now, when someone disagrees, you may feel something different. Not heat, not adrenaline, just assessment. Is this meaningful? Is this productive? Is this aligned with my energy? If not, you let it pass. That passing is not submission. It is sovereignty. Earlier, silence in an argument may have felt like defeat. Now, silence feels like choice. You are no longer fighting for psychological survival. You are selecting where your energy goes. Jung wrote about the integration of opposites, how the mature personality can hold contradiction without collapsing into one-sidedness. When you can hold your own perspective while allowing another's to exist, conflict loses its binary structure. It is no longer win or lose. It is simply difference. And difference does not require dominance. There is also something humbling here. You may recognize how often past arguments were less about truth and more about ego protection, about being seen as competent, as morally consistent, as intellectually superior. As shadow integrates, you see that in yourself. And once you see it, the impulse weakens, because you no longer need that reinforcement. You may even feel a kind of detachment from drama, not apathy, just clarity. You see the escalation happening. You see the emotional charge rising. And instead of joining it, you observe it. Observation creates distance. Distance creates choice. Choice creates restraint. Restraint creates quiet. This quiet is not indifference. It is containment. Earlier, intensity may have made you feel alive. Now, coherence does. Earlier, argument may have felt like power. Now, self-regulation feels stronger. Jung believed that individuation leads to what he called psychological wholeness. Not perfection, not moral superiority, but inner cohesion. Inner cohesion reduces the need to fight externally, because you are not fragmented inside. When you are internally divided, external conflict mirrors that division. When you are internally integrated, external conflict loses its grip. You may notice that you no longer replay arguments in your head as much. You don't rehearse better comebacks. You don't ruminate on what you should have said, because the argument did not threaten your core. It did not destabilize you. It was just an exchange. That reduction in rumination is a major shift. It means your nervous system is no longer activated by disagreement. You are not suppressing reaction. You are not avoiding confrontation. You are proportionate, and proportionate responses rarely escalate. This does not mean you tolerate disrespect. It does not mean you never assert boundaries. It means assertion is measured. When something truly violates your values, you speak. But you do not engage in every friction point. You do not argue for sport. You do not debate for ego reinforcement. You do not escalate for stimulation. That restraint can feel strange if you once identified as passionate and argumentative. But passion is not volume. And conviction is not combat. You can hold strong values without turning every difference into a battleground. Jung warned that addiction does not only apply to substances. It applies to psychological patterns. Conflict can become addictive. The rush, the clarity, the sense of dominance. When that addiction fades, life feels calmer. And calm can feel unfamiliar if you are used to intensity. But calm is not emptiness. It is stability. You are not losing fire. You are no longer burning unnecessarily. And that is strength in its mature form. If you don't argue like you used to, don't confuse that with weakness. Don't assume you become passive. Don't assume you've lost conviction. Don't assume you've dulled. Look deeper. Carl Jung understood that when the ego is still fragile, it protects itself through identification. Beliefs become armor. Opinions become territory. Disagreement becomes invasion, and invasion demands defense. But as individuation unfolds, something shifts. You begin to realize, I have beliefs, but I am not my beliefs. That separation is profound, because once you are no longer fused with your ideas, disagreement stops threatening your existence. You don't feel erased when someone disagrees. You don't feel diminished when someone misunderstands you. You don't feel compelled to dominate in order to feel whole. Earlier, winning may have felt stabilizing. Now, stability is internal. And when stability is internal, you no longer need external victory to confirm it. You can let someone be wrong. You can let someone misunderstand you. You can let a debate end unfinished. Not because you are indifferent, but because your identity does not depend on resolution. Jung warned that inflation often disguises itself as righteousness. The ego can feel powerful when it is certain, but certainty without integration is brittle. True strength is quieter. It does not require applause. It does not require conquest. It does not require correction at every turn. It requires coherence. You argue less because you are less fragmented. You defend less because you are less threatened. You escalate less because you are more stable. That is not withdrawal from life. It is maturity within it. Winning once made you feel secure. Now, security makes winning unnecessary. And that is the difference between ego defense and ego integration. You are not losing your fire. You are no longer burning to survive. You are standing without needing to fight for space. And that kind of strength does not need volume. It needs only presence.